Hello, my name is Michael Tesaro and I've prepared this video presentation about the ACCC's recent ex-post review of a number of its merger decisions. Now, a bit of background about myself. I'm a competition and consumer lawyer and I've been running my own practice, Tesaro Legal Consulting, for about 13 years. And at that time I've helped a few companies in relation to mergers, and I've also been appointed as an independent auditor of a number of ACCC mandated divestitures. Prior to that, I worked at the ACCC for 15 years, and one of my roles there was the director in charge of the Sydney Mergers and Asset Sales branch. And in that role, I ran a team and we conducted about 100 merger clearances. We also ran some divestiture matters and some litigation. So I've got quite a lot of experience in the mergers area from those two roles. Now, outlining the presentation, I'll start with a quick introduction, then go through the methodology that the ACCC employed to conduct its review, then discuss the goals which the ACCC is seeking to achieve by doing market reviews, then a relatively short summary of each of the 6 mergers they looked at, then identify the key takeaways that the ACCC set out in the report, and then finish with my own commentary on the review. Now, by way of introduction, the ACCC conducted 6 ex-post reviews of mergers in 2021, and there's a list of the 6 mergers that they looked at. And the idea behind this was to inform and improve their merger investigative processes. And these are very popular to do these reviews internationally. A number of other regulators have been doing them. The key is to make them publicly available so that businesses and legal advisors can understand better the way the ACCC approaches things. As you can see, the 6 mergers, there's a couple in the same industry. Number 2 and 3 are both in the stationery industry. So you've got a situation there where the expectations and findings of the ACCC for those 2 mergers are the same. And the last one's a bit different. That's a merger involving Landmark and Ruralco, where the ACCC concluded it was going to lessen competition and required a divestiture package. And so the analysis here is whether that divestiture package was effective in addressing competition concerns. Now, the ACCC's methodology is set out. They make it very clear that they're not seeking to determine whether they made the right decision in relation to these 6 matters. Rather, they want to look at the specific predictions made by the ACCC merger parties and third parties about various merger factors. So there would have been conclusions made by the ACCC about the potential of new entry or the exercise of countervailing power, which would have influenced the way they made their decision. So they want to check out whether those specific predictions were correct, but they're only looking at those predictions which had some influence on the final outcome. Other issues of the methodology, they obviously chose matters which were unopposed in their substance, and so that makes sense. They also ensured they chose matters where they had sufficient information and data to make a sensible analysis and some conclusions. They also ensured that a sufficient time had elapsed since the merger to see how various factors had played out in the market. And finally, they chose matters that had some potential relevance to the ACCC's future investigations. So as you can see, they were quite selective in the matters that they chose to review. Now, the goals which the ACCC is seeking to achieve by doing market reviews is spelled out in the report, and clearly the main goal is to try and improve the quality of their decision making. It's very important to look at previous cases to see how factors have been analysed and work out whether they've come to the right conclusions. But also they're looking at the effectiveness of the tools and models which they use to make predictions, and they're set out in the merger guidelines. So this might suggest that they're going to look at the tools they have and maybe look for new tools to assist their processes. Also, to improve the processes and efficiency with which they undertake their merger reviews, and verify the soundness of the economic theories on which they base their decisions. And that's a real bone of contention now. There's a lot of discussion at the moment whether the economic theories which underpin a lot of merger regimes are out of date, whether they need to be updated, taking into consideration additional factors. Also, they want to improve transparency and confidence in ACCC's decision making, and clearly the preparation and public release of these review type documents will go a long way to improving transparency and confidence amongst businesses and legal advisors in the way the ACCC does its job in relation to mergers. Also, they want to look at the policy issues. They want to evaluate the effectiveness of merger policy in Australia. And clearly, if merger policy is not meeting the challenges being put upon it, particularly by digital platforms, then it's clearly an argument that the ACCC wants to have about potential law reform. Now, looking at the first merger, it's Caltex's acquisition of Milemaker Petroleum, which was a small player in the Victorian market, had a number of stores in Melbourne, Geelong, and in regional Victoria, about 45 stores, and it clearly was a vigorous and effective competitor in the market with a reputation as being a discounter. And the ACCC concluded that there were a sufficient number of other vigorous and effective price competitors in the market who'd be able to put sufficient competitive pressure on the merged firm to prevent the exercise of market power. On that ACCC's report, they've included this diagram which shows the impact of the merger on pricing in the broader market, and it tells a very negative picture. As you can see, pre-acquisition, looking at the whole cycle pricing, Milemaker was a very significant discounter of petrol prices in the relevant markets. Post-acquisition, that's totally reversed. It's effectively not a price discounter anymore, and not only has its prices generally increased by about 0.5% a litre, but Caltex appears to have taken the opportunity of the merger to increase its own prices on average by over a cent per litre. The discounting phase is when retailers seek to push down prices and offer discounted prices in the market. And as you can see there, Milemaker pre-acquisition was a very large player in that area, that it was often pushing down prices and keeping prices down and providing deep discounts. However, post-acquisition, that's totally reversed. Now it's no longer seen as a discounter, and in fact Caltex has no longer had to respond to the competitive pressures being put on it by Milemaker, and has been able to increase its own prices. Finally, the restoration phase, which is the phase that occurs post a discounting phase. So effectively what retailers seek to do after a discounting phase is push the prices back to where they were pre-discounting. And as you can see, Milemaker had a very significant role there in resisting the restoration phase, keeping prices down for longer, and I guess forcing the rest of the market to do the same. But as you can see, Caltex didn't have that reputation pre-acquisition, and post-acquisition, not only has Milemaker reversed its position as a company that resists the restoration phase, but Caltex is moving prices back very high very quickly after a discounting phase. ACCC also included this particular diagram, which seeks to compare markets where Milemaker was present with those where it wasn't present. So effectively, it's looking more at the local market impact of the merger. And where Milemaker was in the market, obviously its local competitors would have to be aware of its price and follow it. So effectively, the markets where Milemaker were present were more competitive markets. So as you can see here, the analysis shows that in those highly competitive markets, effectively the price competition that Milemaker offered has gone. The whole cycle pricing has shown a very large increase above the line, a lot of red marks there on the right hand side. The discounting phase is almost entirely above the line. You've got a few there in the transition phase, and then obviously the level of discounting in these local markets has evaporated with the acquisition. And finally, the restoration phase is all over the place a bit, but the general trend there is upwards. The second mergers are in the stationery sector. Platinum Equities acquisition of Officemax and Complete Office Supplies acquisition of Lyrico. And again, the ACCC concluded that whilst there was likely to be a lessening competition, it was unlikely to substantially lessen competition in the market. And as you can see, they referred there to large commercial and government customers in Australia, which is the market that these two companies provided products to. And the inference there is that these large commercial and government customers would have a significant degree of countervailing power. They'd be able to move their sales away from the merged firms if prices were seeking to be increased post-acquisition. So the findings of the ACCC aren't based on the same pricing data that they had in the Caltex matter. It's more anecdotal interviews with market participants. But the good news is that the ACCC was not able to identify any significant negative competitive effects as a result of the acquisitions. So this would suggest that the competitive pressures being put on the merger parties by other players such as Officeworks or even Amazon had an impact on restraining any price increases. Also, changes in buying patterns, a lot more people buying products online and also spreading their purchases across a wider range of suppliers rather than getting all their products from a wholesaler operator like these companies. So this is one that the ACCC's predictions about the market have been made out. The next merger involved Emergent Coal's acquisition of AB Oxford, and this is in the coal storage sector. And as you can see, the acquisition reduced the number of large coal storage providers active in Victoria from 4 to 3, which would automatically set off major alarm bells. Clearly, the barriers to entry in this market are high, and the reduction of 4 to 3 is generally a large concern. But the ACCC concluded after it completed its investigation that the merger was unlikely to substantially lessen competition for 3 reasons. Firstly, they believed that Emergent would still face considerable competitive constraint from Newcold, Americold, and other small suppliers in the market. Also, they believed there was a potential for expansion by those suppliers as sponsored by larger customers. So, in other words, the larger customers could have exercised countervailing power by moving their sales from the merger parties to these other suppliers and thus defeating an attempt to exercise market power. The other example of countervailing power is the prospect of large customers backward vertically integrating. So countervailing power has 2 faces. One is the ability to move sales away from a merger party to another company to feed a price increase. But the second way of achieving that is to actually backward vertically integrate into the relevant market to, in this case, set up your own cold storage facilities. So the ACCC believed that these were all possible threats in the market which would prevent the exercise of market power. Unfortunately, it appears that the ACCC's views about the constraints were wrong, because they found in their post-review that there'd been significant price rises directly as a result of the loss of competition in the market. And what they saw here was that there was significant price discrimination occurring. Effectively, the merger party did not increase prices to the larger customers in the market who genuinely had some level of countervailing power, but unfortunately prices to medium-sized and small customers were increased. And as you can see there, it suggests that there were significant price increases by between 5 to 10%. The next merger relates to the funeral industry. Propel Funeral Partners' acquisition of Gregson and Waite Funeral Directors. And this related to 2 different markets. One was the provision of funeral director services, and the second was in relation to the operation of crematoria. And the ACCC concluded that the acquisition would not result in market concentration that would lessen competition. And again, they didn't have the detailed pricing information that they had in the first merger, but they were able to work out through anecdotal evidence that the prices for crematoria services to consumers in the relevant local market hadn't increased as a result of the acquisition. So that's a good outcome which supports the ACCC's views that there was sufficient competition in the market to prevent that occurring. But also there was no access concern. So what you're concerned about in funeral markets, crematoria and cemeteries is that if a company's vertically integrated, that they might deny access to their funeral director competitors downstream, or just provide them with less favourable access. So, for example, they might book them shorter times in the crematoria or give them very early times or very late times. So these are kind of things that can happen to exercise market power against your downstream competitors. And the ACCC found in this particular case that there had been no access concerns raised. So their views in this particular case seem to have been made out. The final of the 6 mergers is Landmark's acquisition of Ruralco in the agricultural products market. And the ACCC did find that the acquisition was going to substantially lessen competition in a number of local markets, Broome, Alice Springs and Hughenden. And there was an obligation put on the parties to divest their operations in these 3 locations in order to remove any competitive concerns. And what the ACCC found was that the divested Landmark businesses in Alice Springs and Hughenden had been effective in preventing the exercise of market power. So effectively, the company which bought those operations had been able to establish as a vigorous and effective competitor in those particular markets and thus defeat the exercise of market power. So again, in this particular case, it was an example of a successful divestiture outcome. Now, the key takeaways that the ACCC identified in their report were as follows. Firstly, that the removal of a vigorous and effective competitor with a small market share can have a significant impact on markets. And this appears to me to be a reference to the Caltex merger, where Milemaker was clearly a very vigorous and effective competitor, a big price discounter, and its removal from the market, even though it only had 45 odd sites across the whole of Victoria, has now impacted competition very negatively by removing their influence. And so this is a very significant takeaway because it supports ACCC's view that digital platforms acquisitions of nascent competitors or killer acquisitions could have significant impacts in the market, but the question is whether the current laws are able to address those killer acquisitions. So this supports the view that they've been talking about for a while, that killer acquisitions can be a major concern for competition regulators. The second one was that the ACCC needs to be sceptical as to whether the benefit of competitive constraints on a particular segment will be carried over to other segments. I think this might be a reference to the cold storage merger, where there was a belief potentially that the market power of the merged firm would be constrained by the countervailing market power of the large customers, and that somehow that threat of exercise of countervailing power by those customers would assist customers who are in the medium and small end of the market. Now, I just can't understand how the ACCC could have believed that was possible where the market was susceptible to price discrimination and there was no opportunity for arbitrage. Surely, if there is price discrimination and no arbitrage, there's really no way that the competitive constraints on one particular segment will be carried over to another segment. So this is a strange takeaway. It seems that the ACCC is rightly to be sceptical of the possibility of that occurring in markets where you have the twin problems of price discrimination and no arbitrage. Then the third takeaway is the likelihood of new entry expansion and the ability of third parties to exercise countervailing power has been routinely overestimated. And I think this is an interesting observation because the key question here is the threat of new entry and expansion, and the threat of the exercise of countervailing power is what you're really looking at. In mergers, you're not opposing. You're not expecting companies to actually enter new markets or expand, or even customers to exercise countervailing power. Rather, the merger party sees these as genuine threats, and therefore they're prevented from increasing prices. The only reason these things occur usually is if a company does seek to exercise market power, takes a chance that there won't be new entry, there won't be expansion, there won't be the exercise of countervailing market power, increases prices, and then these events occur. So I think that's an important observation that the ACCC needs to focus in on the threat of these things occurring and whether the threat is a credible threat. The final issue that the ACCC identified as the most concerning, and that's that merger parties and third parties appear to have distorted or omitted critical information relevant to the ACCC's analysis. And in this regard, the ACCC identifies 4 examples. The first is that they refer to one review where a party submitted to the ACCC that a competitor was a very viable competitor, was imminently going to expand their operations, and that would increase their competitiveness in the market. But just a short time later, in a different review, the ACCC received a totally contradictory submission that that same competitor was actually a failing firm and facing imminent risk of closure. It seems to be a reference to the stationary merger. But here there's a strong inference that one of those 2 parties was obviously providing false information to the ACCC about this effective competitor in the market. There was another example of an acquirer providing some internal documents to the ACCC which anticipated significant increases in revenues as a result of the merger, but then subsequently documents were submitted to the ACCC which excluded all that forecast of material revenue increases. So the observation which the ACCC is making here was that the document may have been doctored and certain information removed so that it wouldn't be negative towards the prospects of the merger being approved. So again, that's a concern of the ACCC, that it's actually getting documents that are genuine documents and don't tell a false story. The third example is that some merger parties made submissions to the ACCC that they needed to do the merger in order to upgrade and expand the facilities of the target and to bring about further competition. So the ACCC put some weight on these future plans to expand the operations of the target and thus to increase competition in the market. The ACCC noted in its review that many months after the merger had been finalised, none of these plans to upgrade and expand the target's facility had occurred. So the inference there is that the ACCC was misled about the plans for the target's facility. There's always a possibility that the merged firm might have changed its mind, but I think the strong inference is that the ACCC believes it was misled. The final one is very concerning because it sort of says that a merger party did not disclose that it was imminently going to be acquired by another overseas participant. Now that was very relevant information, particularly if the merger parties were pointing to that overseas participant as a potential entrant to the Australian market, and the ACCC put weight on that. So this is a case where the merger parties have not disclosed a very relevant bit of information to the ACCC. Now a bit of commentary about the review. The first thing that is really undeniable is, do those mergers look like clear breaches of the law? Clearly, the Caltex mergers had a very negative impact on pricing. It's removed a vigorous and effective competitor in the form of MileMaker, and discounting has been removed from many of these markets. So that looks like a pretty clear breach of Section 50 of the Act. The other one that looks clearly like a breach is the emergent cold storage merger, which has resulted in very large price increases being imposed on medium and small players. Now, the second issue is that there seems to be some confusion in the ACCC analysis. They talk about whether particular events have occurred, and I think they underplay the importance of recognising that it's about the threat of things happening. A merger should be unopposed if the threat of new entry, the threat of countervailing power, the threat of imports are genuine threats, credible threats. Then the merger party won't go ahead and seek to exercise market power. But these things won't occur in those contexts because the threat is sufficient. You don't actually have to go ahead and do any of these things if the threat is credible. So I think the ACCC seems to be a bit unclear about that point. The other point that seems unclear is the idea that competitive restraints in one market that impact a particular segment of the market will somehow move across to the other market where there is price discrimination and no ability to engage in arbitrage. There's no way that countervailing power in one market segment is going to move across to another market segment if those circumstances exist. Price discrimination and no opportunity for arbitrage. So that seemed a bit confusing to me as well. Finally, the major concern is the accuracy of information that's been provided to the ACCC. I remember when I was running the Sydney Mergers and Asset Sales branch, we had a few instances where companies and legal advisors provided us with questionable information, but it seems to have deteriorated quite a lot since I was at the ACCC, and it seems that many more companies are providing false information and misleading information to the ACCC, and some of it appears to be quite blatant. So that's a concern. That's probably music to the ACCC's ears because it wants to change the merger laws, wants to bring in a formal system which involves specific information obligations on merger parties and a suspensory system. So all this analysis assists them in their arguments with government that these changes need to be introduced. The other thing that this seems to support is that the new laws which the ACCC has been pushing for in relation to digital platforms and the need to have a change to merger laws to be able to deal with killer acquisitions has been supported by, I think, particularly the Caltex merger, where there was a small player in the market with a significant reputation for discounting, which was allowed to proceed, and there's been negative impacts in the market. And clearly in the digital space, there are a lot of nascent competitors who haven't achieved any real scale, who are having a big impact on competition, and if not acquired, would develop greater capacity to compete in the markets. So I think this has lent further support to the ACCC's campaign for specific laws to address the issue of killer acquisitions. So that's all I had. It is concerning that two mergers seem to have slipped through the nets that were clearly anti-competitive, but I think the efforts of the ACCC to review its mergers, and I guess the honesty of the ACCC to include those two mergers in its analysis was very admirable, and I think the ACCC will no doubt continue these market reviews in future, which will add a lot to our store of knowledge about the way mergers are conducted, both from the ACCC perspective and the submissions that have been made by merger parties. So if you have any questions about this presentation, please feel free to give me a call or drop me an email. Bye-bye.